I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise. And this is our delayed first event of the semester. We were supposed to have this several weeks ago, but they shut down the university on us. Anyhow, I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise, and we host reading groups, sponsor speaker events like this one today, have colloquiums and other events for students that examine the ideas of free enterprise. Some of the other events we will have this semester: on March 6th at 4:30 in this auditorium, we'll be hosting a Bitcoin policy expert, Naomi Brockwell, and crypto lawyer, Sasha Hodder, and they're going to discuss Bitcoin and regulation. Can they coexist? Then on April 10th at 4:30, Julie Stackhouse and David Andafato from the St. Louis Fed, they're going to demystify blockchain for us, and we can ask them what the Fed's point of view is on Bitcoin as a currency. By the way, U of L has a blockchain club, and if you're interested, several members are in the audience right up here in the front, and you can talk to them about blockchain and about the club. It's actually a pretty interesting group. Also, I'll be participating with Professors Avery Kohlers in philosophy, Ricky Jones in Pan-African Studies, and Anita Moorman from Sports Administration on a panel discussing whether or not college athletes should be paid. And so that could be an interesting topic, and that's going to be on March 20th, a Wednesday, in the Chow Auditorium at 4:30 to about 6:30. So anyhow, I hope you guys can make all of these events. Also, as you came in, you should have received a survey about today's program, so please take a couple minutes to fill that out. And we use these comments for planning our future programs, and we really would appreciate any thoughts you have. Also, if you're here for extra credit, you need to completely fill out that form so we can know what class you're in and what professor you are coming here for. Finally, before I start at the introduction of Will, I want to thank our sponsor for this event, the Institute for Humane Studies. The Institute was founded in 1961 by Dr. F.A. Baldy Harper, and he was a professor of economics at Cornell University. And the Institute supports partnerships like this and promotes ideas of free enterprise and do things to advance higher education's core purpose of intellectual discovery and human progress. Sorry about that. Jeez. They must have gotten glued together. Here we go. The IHS has also sponsored a colloquium. We just had a colloquium this weekend with several students, 18 students from the University of Louisville, Clemson University, University of Kentucky, and Bellarmine University. It was a really nice event. We read a book, and we read several articles and discussed them all day, ate some really good food. If you're interested in the reading groups or these colloquiums, we send out emails to students in the College of Business. All you have to do is sign up. So today we're going to hear from Will Luther from Florida Atlantic University. Will's an assistant professor there, and he's also the director of the American Institute for Economic Research's Sound Money Project, and an adjunct scholar with the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. In October 2018, he was ranked 71st on the Social Sciences Research Network's top 12,000 business authors. His research focuses primarily on questions of currency acceptance. He's published articles in leading scholarly journals, including the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Inquiry, Journal of Institutional Economics, Public Choice, and the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance. His popular works have appeared in The Economist, Forbes magazine, U.S. News and World Report. He's also been cited by major media outlets, including NPR, Vice News, and Al Jazeera. He earned his MA and PhD in economics from George Mason University and a BA in economics from Capital University. Today he's going to talk about Bitcoin and is Bitcoin a bubble? He'll take questions after his presentation. Questions should be short and to the point. And the Q&A is primarily for students, so we will open up this discussion, the questions to them first. Anyhow, Will, thank you for coming.
So the price of Bitcoin has fluctuated a lot in recent years. So when I was first thinking about Bitcoin, when I first introduced to Bitcoin, one Bitcoin was just $3.40. That was pretty low. When I first started writing about Bitcoin, so that was back in 2010, when I first started writing about Bitcoin in 2012, Bitcoin is still less than $1,000. In April of 2013, it was $134, and boy, has it changed a lot since. April of 2017, over $1,300 for one Bitcoin. Of course, in December of 2017, up to almost $20,000 for a Bitcoin, and today, just over $3,900 for a Bitcoin. So that's a lot of price volatility over a relatively short period of time, and naturally, this has left a lot of folks, financial market commentators and economists like myself, kind of scratching their heads. What's going on here? Why is there so much price volatility in this market? Is Bitcoin a bubble? Now, maybe you came here today not knowing much about Bitcoin at all, let alone whether or not it's a bubble. So rest assured, we're going to start with the very basics. What is Bitcoin? Why does it have any value at all, if it has any value at all? And then hopefully we can get to a point where we can consider that price volatility and ultimately put you in a position where you're able to answer this question for yourself: is Bitcoin a bubble? And so let me say straight away, I'm much less concerned with giving you an answer to this question: is Bitcoin a bubble? Because I think reasonable people can disagree about that. I'm much more interested in providing you with a framework to think about this question so that you know what questions you should be asking to figure out whether Bitcoin is a bubble. So let's start off with the basics. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is an unbacked digital currency. It allows you to make transactions on the internet. So we'll unpack that a bit. It's unbacked, so that means it's not a commodity money. It's not a money like historical monies like gold or silver or salt. These are monies that have some use apart from any role they might play as a medium of exchange. It's also not backed by some commodity. And so historically, for example, banks would issue bank notes, not the kind of bank notes that we're used to, but notes that were actually redeemable claims for some underlying commodity like gold or silver. And so those bank notes were a contractual obligation. If you took those bank notes to the bank of issue, they were contractually obligated to hand over a pre-specified amount of gold if it was a gold-backed note, or silver if it was a silver-backed note. But Bitcoin is an unbacked digital money. So not only is it not a commodity, but it's also not redeemable for any commodity. That means it's a lot more like the kind of monies you and I are used to using today, like the dollar, the euro, the renminbi, what we, at least before Bitcoin, referred to as fiat monies. Fiat monies. These are monies that might serve some useful medium of exchange role, but they're not redeemable for any underlying commodity, and they're not useful for anything other than functioning as a medium of exchange. What do you do with your dollars aside from spend them? Okay, I suppose that your physical dollars, you could use them to wallpaper your house or something like that, but what about your digital dollars in your bank account? Their only use is for spending, right? So Bitcoin is a lot like that. It's not redeemable for any underlying commodity. It's only exchangeable to the extent that others are willing to accept it in exchange. Now, I said that we used to call these kind of monies fiat monies. Now, it's a little less clear if that term is appropriate for all monies that are like that, because the word fiat actually means by decree. By decree. And traditionally, we thought that these kind of monies that didn't have any non-monetary use, that is, they're only useful as a medium of exchange, they could only be introduced by governments, and they would circulate by decree. But now we have an example of a privately issued alternative that's circulating at a positive value, and there is no decree. There is no government order that's supporting that underlying demand. And so it's causing us to rethink our terminology a bit. Now, one last thing. I said it's an unbacked digital money, but if you look up here on the screen in the background, you can see these physical coins. And it's pretty common. Maybe you read a news article on Forbes to see a picture of a physical Bitcoin. But they're not actually Bitcoins. These are just tokens. tokens. And if you look closely, you'll see on some of these physical coins, there's actually a holographic seal on one side of them. And if you were to peel back that holographic seal, you would see the address where that digital balance of Bitcoin is actually located. And so these aren't Bitcoins actually that we're looking at here. They're tokens that have the address, the digital address, printed on them behind that holographic seal. A Bitcoin is a digital balance that we're going to use to make and receive payments on the internet. Now that's a very simple way of thinking about Bitcoin, but what's really interesting about Bitcoin is the way at which it processes transactions. No, I didn't see a lot of excitement there when I said that the interesting thing is how it processes transactions. And that's because most of us don't think about processing transactions most of the time. But it's very important that transactions get processed. So let's start by thinking about some transaction processing mechanisms that we're a bit more familiar with, so then we can see how Bitcoin processes transactions a bit differently. Let's start with a cash transaction. Cash uses what's called a decentralized clearing process. So imagine that I want to buy maybe some cotton candy from you, and I'm going to pay you with some cash. So you're going to hand me some cotton candy, and I'm going to hand you a balance of physical cash. Physical cash has some interesting properties to it. So when I pull out my wallet and you see that balance of cash, you know that I own that balance of cash. It's in my possession. And when I hand that cash to you, you receive that cash. Right now, you know that you own that balance of cash. And importantly, since this is a physical item, this cash, when that cash leaves my hands and enters yours, I'm no longer in a position to spend that balance of cash. That turns out to be very important, right? It means that physical cash is not subject to a double spending problem. Once I relinquish ownership to that cash, you now own it and I don't. Digital assets are very different. I think about an MP3, for example. Right, so if I have the latest Taylor Swift album and I can listen to that MP3, I can transfer that MP3 to you and you can listen to that MP3. But I don't have to relinquish ownership to that MP3 in order to give it to you. Right? You have the album, I have the album, we both have the album. So that MP3 file is a pretty terrible currency. Right? That would be like me being able to give you cash without giving it up. And so I would be able to spend that balance of cash again. Now, traditionally, the way we've dealt with digital balances is by using a centralized clearing mechanism. So in the decentralized clearing mechanism, the transaction takes place between two parties, right? The two parties to the exchange. In a centralized clearing mechanism, we rely on some trusted third party to process our transaction for us. So perhaps instead of engaging in a cash transaction, I write you a check or swipe my debit card at your merchant terminal. And let's just suppose that we're both members of the same bank. So I bank at Chase. Anyone else here bank at Chase? Okay. So we're both Chase customers. When I transfer a balance of money to you from my Chase account, either through a check or a debit card or an electronic funds transfer, right? What does Chase do? Well, Chase provides much of the same functions as that cash transaction being processed that we thought about earlier. That is, Chase certifies that I have that balance of funds, right? They debit my account and credit your account, right? So now you have those funds. And by acting as that trusted third party, by maintaining that ledger, they ensure that I am unable to spend that balance of funds again. That is, they prevent the double spending problem that would otherwise result from a digital asset. How many of you don't bank at Chase? Where do you bank?
It's a local bank.
Okay. What is it?
Wilson and Muir.
Okay. So we have a different bank. And so how does that work? Right. Well, there we use a higher level of centralized clearing. Right. So maybe we would use the clearinghouse interbank payment system. That is, they would debit Chase's account and credit your bank's account, or maybe FedWire. You'll have some Fed economists here later in this semester. You should ask David Andolfato about FedWire. And so we have a centralized clearing mechanism just at a higher level. Instead of thinking about debiting my account and crediting your account, we debit my bank's account and credit your account, and then they engage in the relevant debiting and crediting. But in that system, the transaction is being processed through this third party, this trusted third party, that's clearing the transaction between you and I. Now, Bitcoin is a digital asset, and so as a digital asset, it could process transactions this way, but in fact it doesn't. When the Bitcoin protocol was proposed, it came part and parcel with this blockchain technology that enables us to process digital transactions in a way that we did not realize we could process digital transactions before Bitcoin existed. It's processing transactions through a distributed network. Now what that means is that you and I don't have to rely on some trusted third party to debit my account and credit yours. In a very general sense, we're going to use the entire system, all of the computers running this protocol, to debit my account and credit yours. Now that's a very general way of thinking about it. Let's think about it a little more specifically. So at the core of the Bitcoin protocol is what's called a blockchain. You can think of that as a public ledger, much like the ledger that your bank keeps where they debit my account and credit yours. But this is a ledger for all of the Bitcoin in circulation. Anybody who owns a balance of Bitcoin has an address on this ledger. So suppose you want to make a transaction. When you make a transaction, that transaction is grouped together with all of the other transactions that have taken place in roughly a 10-minute window. And all of the computers running this Bitcoin protocol begin racing to solve this complicated computing problem. And what that computing problem, once solved, does is it adds that block of transaction. It chains it to the previous transactions that have been taking place. And so effectively, it debits my account and credits yours when this block of transactions is added to the blockchain. And when another batch of transactions is out there, so you make another transaction, it's blocked together with the transactions that have taken place in the next 10-minute window. Once again, those computers, they start racing to be the first computer to solve this cryptography problem. And once that problem is solved, those transactions are blocked, they're changed to the previous block of transactions. And so what we have is a public ledger of all past transactions and a protocol for updating that ledger. Right? That is, for debiting one person's account and crediting another person's account. So this is a new technology, a new way of processing transactions through this distributed clearing process, as opposed to our previous technologies like a centralized clearing mechanism or a decentralized clearing mechanism. Okay, so we have a kind of a rough idea of what Bitcoin is. It's an unbacked digital money. It allows us to make and receive payments on the internet. It uses this blockchain technology to process payments using a distributed clearing mechanism. But we want to figure out whether or not Bitcoin is a bubble, whether Bitcoin is a bubble. And we're going to think about that term bubble in a very sophisticated way, the way economists think of the term bubble. Economists define a bubble as an asset that has a price that's greater than its fundamental value. That's a technical way of saying it. What that means is that the price is more than it's really worth. Right? So if an asset is in a bubble, the price exceeds its fundamental value. That is, people are paying more for it than it's really worth. And so if we're going to figure out whether Bitcoin is a bubble, it's not enough just to look at its price. The price goes up, it's a bubble. That's what you'll hear people say. Or the price falls markedly, and they'll say, must have been a bubble. Right? But that's not a very sophisticated way of thinking about this question. The first thing we need to figure out is, what's the fundamental value of Bitcoin? It's only once we've identified the fundamental value of Bitcoin can we assess whether the price is greater than, less than, or equal to that fundamental value. So what is the value of Bitcoin? What is Bitcoin's value? Before giving you what I think is the appropriate way of thinking about this, it's useful if we think about two explanations that are quite common that are pretty unsatisfactory. The first explanation is that Bitcoin is valuable because it's costly to produce. Now there's a grain of truth here. It is costly to produce Bitcoin. Remember when I said that a batch of transactions is added to the blockchain because these computers are racing to solve this complicated problem? Well, that complicated problem is costly to solve. You have to use some electricity, and you have to use some machinery, so there's some wear and tear on your machinery. So there are some costs incurred in processing those transactions. In order to induce people, we call them miners, we might also call them transaction processors, that's perhaps a more appropriate term. But in order to induce people to use their electricity and to run their machines to process these transactions, the system rewards the first computer to solve that problem. It rewards it with some new Bitcoin. Some Bitcoin that's never been in circulation before. And so what does that mean? That means the production of that Bitcoin, those new Bitcoins, when they enter circulation because some transactions have been processed, and those transaction process is costly to do. And so we can say it's costly to produce Bitcoin. But that's not the source of Bitcoin's value. I tell my students, never reason from cost to value. Always reason from value to cost. Now this gets a little confusing. So maybe you've heard people say things before like, doctors, they make a lot of money because they have to spend so much time in school. Right? That is, it's costly to be a doctor, and so doctors earn high salaries. But that's not quite right. It's not quite right. It gets the reasoning backwards. Right? The reason that doctors spend so much time in school is because the services that they will be able to provide when they're finished with that schooling is very valuable. If plumbers spent just as much time in school as doctors, would plumbers make such high salaries? No. Because at the end of the day, they're just unclogging your pipes. They're not doing heart surgery or something like that. Right? And so it's actually the value that induces those doctors to incur those costs. And it's much the same thing with this costly production of Bitcoin. We can't say that Bitcoin is valuable because it's costly to produce. Rather, it's that these miners, these transaction processors, they're incurring the cost of running their machines and using their electricity because Bitcoin is valuable, because they expect that Bitcoin is going to be valuable. That's why they're incurring those costs. And so if they're incurring the costs because Bitcoin is valuable, we can't say that Bitcoin is valuable because of those costs. All right, let's think about explanation number 2. Sometimes you'll hear people say that Bitcoin is valuable because of speculative demand. It's valuable because people are just speculating. And again, there's a grain of truth here. Is there speculation in the market for Bitcoin? Absolutely. Of course there's speculation in the market for Bitcoin. Because there's speculation in every market. In fact, it's hard to think of a single action that we engage in where there's not some speculation involved. All of you, at least most of you, some of you look like maybe you've graduated a few years ago, some of you a few more than a few years. Most of you sitting here are students, and you're engaged in an act of speculation. Right? Many of you are coming here to get a degree, presumably because you expect, and with good reason, that with that degree you're going to be able to get a job that you wouldn't have been able to get without that degree. And so you'll earn a salary that's higher than the salary that you would have earned if you didn't have that degree. Now, do you know that with absolute certainty? Of course not. Many of you don't even know exactly what job it is that you'll get. But you're speculating. You're making a guess about those future values. Now, it's usually a pretty safe bet in terms of a college degree. But the point is that you have to engage in speculation here because you don't know everything you would need to know not to speculate. The future is to some extent unknown and unknowable. And so speculation is something we have to do. The relevant question isn't whether there's speculation or not, but whether that speculation is well-founded. Whether it's a relatively good guess or a crazy guess. Right? That's the relevant question here. Now, typically when people say that Bitcoin is valuable because of speculative demand, they're often expressing this in a much stronger version. They're saying that Bitcoin's only source of value is speculative demand. To that, I just ask you this. Imagine that a decade ago I proposed a new technology to you. I said, I've got this ability that allows you to transfer value anywhere around the world at a relatively low cost, instantaneously. I'm guessing none of you would have said, worthless. No value there. Right? That sounds a bit crazy, right? There must be some value to a technology like that. And so this very strong version of speculative demand, right, where the only source of value is speculation, that's probably a bit too strong as well. So what is the fundamental value of Bitcoin? Bitcoin, if it's valuable at all, it's valuable in enabling us to transfer wealth virtually anywhere around the world at a relatively low cost, almost instantaneously. That's the value of Bitcoin. It's valuable as a medium of exchange, as a medium through which we exchange what we have for what we want. Now, again, it's an unbacked digital money, and so if no one is willing to accept it, then its value, its fundamental value is zero. But provided that there are people who are willing to accept Bitcoin, then it's going to have some fundamental value as a medium of exchange. So let's think about why we might want to use Bitcoin, why we might want to be some of those people who use Bitcoin to make transactions and therefore give it a fundamental value. Well, it turns out that there are some features of Bitcoin that make it especially attractive for some transactions. Now, I want to say at the outset, it's very common when we're thinking about why one would use Bitcoin to commit what I like to call the all or nothing fallacy. Right? Bitcoin is either useful for every transaction or it's useful for no transactions. Right? That's the all or nothing fallacy. We don't have to be in either of those extreme camps. We just need to identify some situations where Bitcoin might be a better medium of exchange than our alternatives. Right? And so we'll think about some features of Bitcoin that might make it useful for some transactions while recognizing that it might not be useful for all transactions. And so one, Bitcoin is global in nature. Right? Anywhere in the world, if you have access to the internet, you can make or receive transactions with Bitcoin. That's especially important in places where there are capital controls, for example. Right? Where there are capital controls. You might not have access to other payment technologies to transfer wealth across borders because the traditional banking system is not permitted to make those transactions. Right? And so that it's global in nature. Right? If you want to send a big balance of funds across borders, that might be a useful feature. It's also pseudonymous, or sometimes we'll say quasi-anonymous. Not quite anonymous, but something close to anonymous. It protects your identity from being readily visible. So why might you want a pseudonymous payment technology? Let me say a bit more about that. So I said that we have this public ledger, a public ledger that anyone can see, and any balance of Bitcoin that anyone owns is listed on that ledger, but the account name is just a string of characters. Right? You don't have to reveal your identity when you create that account where someone can send a Bitcoin to. And so what that means is that you can potentially receive a balance of Bitcoin that your identity, your physical identity is not tied to. And so you can transact with that balance of Bitcoin. You can send it to someone whose address you know. Maybe they post their public address online, and so you can send them a payment or a donation without revealing your identity. Or you can post your public address and tell folks where to send funds to without revealing your public identity. And so this gives you a degree of financial privacy. Now, it's not perfect. It's not an anonymous payment technology. Right? A few years ago, there was a guy named Ross William Albrecht who allegedly, and now is convicted of, having started a site called the Silk Road, where people were exchanging illegal substances and services. Mostly they were just buying and selling pot. But it was a marketplace where you could only use Bitcoin. Right? Now, Ross William Albrecht is in prison, not anonymous. His balance of Bitcoin was seized and later auctioned off by the U.S. Marshals. And so not perfectly anonymous. I think that's a QED on that one, no question about that. But pseudonymous. That is, so long as you're able to protect the link between your physical identity and your digital address, no one knows that it's you making these transactions. In some ways, it's less anonymous than payment technologies we have, like cash, right? So if you make a purchase for some pot on the Silk Road back in, say, 2012, right? You can make that transaction without revealing your identity, but if at any point your address gets linked to your identity, we can go back to that public ledger and trace all of your past transactions. Compare that with a cash transaction. If you'd made that same transaction face-to-face, right, once you walk away from that transaction, who's going to be able to tie your identity to that cash? Right? There's no lasting record with hand-to-hand cash. There is a lasting record with the blockchain technology. And so, although it's pseudonymous, it's not perfectly anonymous, and in some ways, it's less anonymous than other payment technologies that we have. Now, in some ways, it's more anonymous than those same payment technologies. That is, in that face-to-face transaction, the person you're interacting with, they can readily see your identity. Whereas if you're sending them a balance of Bitcoin, maybe they just know your digital address. They don't know your physical person. And so we have varying degrees of anonymity. So why might someone want access to a pseudonymous payment mechanism? Well, we've already talked about one case, right? Illicit transactions. And cryptocurrencies are useful for illicit transactions. There's no denying that. But perhaps not useful for many illicit transactions. That is, for those face-to-face transactions, cash is probably still a more anonymous payment technology. But are there any non-nefarious reasons why someone might want access to is it all just criminals and tax cheats? Is that the only source for a pseudonymous payment technology? No, I don't think so. In fact, I think there are some very humane, liberal reasons why we might want to live in a world where we have access to a pseudonymous payment technology. Imagine you're in Venezuela at the moment, right, and you'd like to support the opposition party. Probably not a good idea to go through the formal banking system. You probably don't want your name on those lists. It would be much better if you could make that donation with access to a pseudonymous payment technology. Now, you might say, criminal activity. Or you might say, supporting a democratic process. Or suppose your neighbor has fallen on some hard times and you want to help them out. You could just write them a check or give them some cash. But maybe you've been in a situation like that. You know there's going to be a sense of obligation. They're going to feel like they need to pay you back. If you don't want that, wouldn't it be nice to have access to a payment technology where you could send them a balance of funds and they not be able to know that it came from you? Seems like a very reasonable use of a pseudonymous payment technology. Right? And so some of those uses are certainly criminal, no doubt about that. But criminals use payment technologies that we already have. There are also some perfectly non-criminal uses of a pseudonymous payment technology. Here's another, dare I say, boring reason why we might want to use a Bitcoin for transactions, but it turns out a very important reason. It has the potential to lower transaction costs. So maybe you didn't know this, but one really big cost that especially small businesses have to deal with is what's called chargeback fraud. So if you go to your local gas station, you fill up your tank and you leave, and then the next day you call up your debit card or credit card company and you say, oh, I saw this transaction on my account. It looks like someone bought $40 worth of gas at a Marathon station. That wasn't me. What will your credit or debit card company typically do? Well, they'll reverse the transaction for one, which means the merchant doesn't get the funds, even though you got the gas. And number two, they hit that merchant with a chargeback fee. It's like even worse than just stealing the gas. right? And so that's a big cost to these small businesses. And with Bitcoin, we have access to a payment technology that's irreversible, right? So once you send the balance, the only way to get it back is if that person returns the balance to you. So it eliminates chargeback fraud. Now, is that a payment technology you would want in all transactions? Certainly not. But there's a set of transactions, the transactions where you might not be able to make that transaction if chargeback fraud is a sufficient risk, where if your alternatives are not being able to make this transaction or make an irreversible payment, you might prefer to make an irreversible payment. All right, one more here. Bitcoin has a predictable supply, So let's think again about the way in which Bitcoin processes transactions. Remember, roughly every 10 minutes, a batch of transactions is added to the blockchain. As compensation for doing that, the first computer to solve this problem gets a new balance of Bitcoin that never existed before. So we know how this money enters the system. New money is created when a block of transactions is processed. We also know how much new money is created because there's a reward structure. For roughly the first 4 years, it was 50 Bitcoin per transaction. And then the reward is cut in half to 25 Bitcoin per transaction. And roughly 4 years after that, 12.5 Bitcoin per batch of transactions, and so on and so forth. So every time a block is added to the blockchain, a pre-specified reward is given out. 50 for the first 4 years, 25 for the next 4 years, and so on and so forth. About every 2 weeks, the system does a check, right? It sees how quickly we're processing this batch of transactions. And if we're processing a batch of transactions more than once every 10 minutes, right, then it actually makes the problem that we solve a little harder to slow down our speed of adding blocks to the blockchain. And if we're not processing those transactions quickly enough, it makes that problem easier to speed up the speed at which we're adding blocks to the blockchain. So that means roughly within a 2-week window, this system is governing itself so that one block is added to the blockchain every 10 minutes. And so that means a new balance of coins, a pre-specified balance of coins, enters circulation every 10 minutes. So we know how much coin is going to enter. We know at what interval it's going to enter every 10 minutes. And with that information, we can trace out the supply of Bitcoin forever. Right? And so here, this solid black line, that's the actual supply of Bitcoin. The dashed line is the projected supply of Bitcoin. And you can see, right on track. Right? And so there's a very predictable supply. We know, for example, that in the year 2140, it's a long time in the future. I don't think we're going to make it. In the year 2140, there will be 21 million coins in circulation. I can't tell you what the monetary base of the United States will be next year. Right? Certainly not with this degree of certainty. And so a very predictable supply. Some folks like that. Okay. So we have a sense of why Bitcoin might be valuable. Maybe you're making global transactions. Maybe you want access to a pseudonymous payment mechanism. Maybe you're dealing in some transactions where you need those lower transaction costs. Maybe you really like this stable supply. But is Bitcoin a bubble? Why does the price fluctuate so much? The first question we should ask is whether or not the fundamental value of Bitcoin could possibly account for all of the price volatility that we observe. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's not unreasonable. And here's why. We have to keep in mind that Bitcoin is a medium of exchange. And media of exchange are different from a lot of the goods and services that you and I purchase. They're subject to what economists call network effects. With a cheeseburger, I know exactly what I'm willing to pay for a cheeseburger because I know how much I like a cheeseburger. But with the medium of exchange, it's no longer about what I like, but what all of you like as well. It says we don't want to be the only person using a given medium of exchange. We want to be using the same medium of exchange as all of our trading partners. The bigger the network of users, the more people we're going to be able to transfer balances of our wealth to and receive balances of wealth from. So network size is very important. If Bitcoin is expected to have a big network in the future, then that means it's going to be a very valuable medium of exchange in the future. And so that means we're going to be willing to pay more for that medium of exchange today. On the other hand, if there are going to be very few people in this network in the future, then it's not going to be very useful. There aren't going to be very many people you can send Bitcoin to or receive Bitcoin from. And so small network, small value medium of exchange, we're not going to be willing to pay very much for that today. So these network effects means that any shock to our information about the network size is just going to be exacerbated by this network effects, more so than most assets. We should also think about government support. If we're thinking about the dollar has a big, stable source of demand. You can pay your taxes with dollars, and the government is going to make its expenditures in dollars. Right? And that's pretty stable. We don't have to worry too much that the government is going to stop accepting dollars for tax payments. And so that means that most people who are making regular transactions with the U.S. government, they're probably going to use dollars as well. And most people who are making transactions with those people who are making regular transactions with the government, they're going to be inclined to accept the dollar. And so that means the extent to which the dollar network can contract is somewhat limited. Right? But Bitcoin has no government support. It doesn't have that government support. And so you can have a really big network, just like you could with the dollar, but the minimum size there of the network with Bitcoin is much smaller. In fact, it's 0. Right? We can have a Bitcoin network where nobody accepts Bitcoin. There's no big, stable source of demand provided by government for Bitcoin like there is with the US dollar. And so there's more scope for variability there. Bitcoin is also not without its problems. Maybe the biggest problem is what's called the scalability problem. The scalability problem. If we go back to how those transactions are processed, remember a transaction is blocked together with other transactions. Computers are racing to solve that problem that links that block of transactions to the blockchain, and this takes place roughly every 10 minutes. Well, it turns out the size of a block of transactions is limited. So you can only get so many transactions into that block. And since you only get one block every 10 minutes, that means you only get so many transactions every 10 minutes. How many transactions? Well, it turns out that at the moment, the Bitcoin system can process somewhere between 3.3 and 7 transactions per second. Now, you're underwhelmed. So am I. Man, you should be underwhelmed. Right? Visa can process 56,000 transactions per second. 3.3 to 7 transactions? That's not enough to process all of the Uber transactions taking place, let alone be a global payment system. And so Bitcoin is subject to this scalability problem. That is, there has to be some way of increasing the amount of transactions that you can execute if this is going to be a big, valuable network. Now, there are solutions on the table, and indeed some solutions that have already been proposed and adopted. Now, let's say one more thing before we say that, though. Why is this a problem? Well, if there are a lot of people trying to make transactions, and only so many transactions that you can make in a period, people are going to start adding transaction fees, right, in order to jump the queue. And that makes it more costly to transact with Bitcoin. So we saw this, for example, when the price of Bitcoin got up to nearly $20,000, and a lot of people wanted to sell their Bitcoin. So there were a lot of transactions being made, and people willing to pay a lot to make those transactions. And the fees shot up, right? It cost more than $30 to make a transaction with Bitcoin. If it costs $30 to make a transaction, a lot of transactions that you and I want to make, we're not going to pay $30 to make those transactions. So then it would only be useful for very large transactions. So we've got to solve this problem. So it's a proposal, segregated witness, SegWit. What it did was it took some of the data that we used to put in that block that contributed to the block size limit, moved that data. And so it no longer contributes to the limit. That allows you to squeeze more transactions in a block of transactions. It allows you to process more transactions per second. But a relatively small fix. Right? And so in the long run, you need a bigger change to the size of this block. And so what does that mean for Bitcoin? Well, all the time we're getting new information about whether we're going to come up with a solution like the Lightning Network, or we're going to raise the block size limit, and whether we're going to be able to get more transactions in a block. Whenever we figure out that, whenever we get new information that suggests we will do those things, right, that means that the future network size of Bitcoin is going to be bigger, and so it'll be a more valuable medium of exchange, and so we're willing to pay more for it today. Price goes up. And anytime we get information that suggests we're not going to overcome that scalability problem, then that tells us that the network is probably not going to be as big as we expected in the future, and so the value is going to be lower and the price of Bitcoin falls today. So we're always getting new information about this scalability problem. All right, the last thing affecting the price fluctuation here is what's called regulatory ambiguity. Because not only are governments not supporting Bitcoin, but some of them are actually opposing them. In some places quite severely, like in Bangladesh, where if you're caught using Bitcoin, you can spend 12 years in prison. Other places like the US, much more lax environment. The US says, okay, you got to pay your capital gains taxes if you realize them with Bitcoin. If you're going to exchange dollars for Bitcoin or Bitcoins for dollars, you have to register as a money services business. But otherwise, people are free to use Bitcoin. And so there's a lot of scope there about the extent to which governments are going to regulate Bitcoin. If we get new information that says that big governments like China, which banned Bitcoin exchanges, it's no longer legal to have an exchange in China where you trade yuan for Bitcoin or Bitcoin for yuan, but then we think, Chinese people are going to be less likely to use Bitcoin. So the network size is going to be smaller than we thought it was before, so the value is lower, and we're willing to pay less for Bitcoin. On the other hand, when we get new information that suggests that a government is not going to be as restrictive to Bitcoin. So for example, a few years ago, there was a proposal to ban Bitcoin in Russia. So in Russia, it's already illegal to use anything other than the ruble for domestic transactions. So they were going to ban Bitcoin. It's legal to use other currencies for foreign transactions. But then that proposal did not go through. So we got some new information that that was not going to happen. That makes us think that the network is going to be bigger than we thought it was going to be. And so it'll be a more valuable network, and the price of Bitcoin goes up as a result. In the US, the regulatory environment is pretty diverse across states. According to Coin Center, there are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 states that it says has a clear and narrowly tailored regulatory environment. The rest it describes as being overbroad and unclear. And all the time we're getting new information about these regulatory environments, and so we get a lot of changes in our expectations of that future network size and a lot of price volatility as a result. So where does this leave us? Is Bitcoin a bubble? Well, there's certainly speculation in this market, but is it necessarily the case that the price of Bitcoin today, around $3,900, is greater than the fundamental value of Bitcoin? That's tough to say definitively. Right? There's been a lot of price volatility in this market, but because Bitcoin is subject to network effects, we should expect there to be a lot of price volatility. And so that's not a very good indicator that Bitcoin is overvalued or that it's a bubble. Right? At the moment, the market capitalization of the monetary base of the United States is around a little over $3.4 trillion. The market capitalization of Bitcoin is around $69 billion. That means the market capitalization of Bitcoin is less than 2% of the market capitalization of the US dollar. Does it seem unreasonable that Bitcoin might one day command a share of global transactions that's roughly on par with, say, 5% of dollar transactions? That doesn't strike me as crazy. Right? And so I don't think that Bitcoin's a bubble. But maybe you reach a different view. Right? Maybe you reach a different view. Maybe you do conclude that Bitcoin is a bubble, that it's overvalued. Or maybe you conclude that it's undervalued. What's much more important is that we understand what that means. Right? When we're talking about a bubble, we're talking about an asset that's price is greater than its fundamental value. And when we're talking about a bubble for a medium of exchange, we got to be thinking about those network effects. So hopefully you're in a better position to answer that question now than you were, say, 40 minutes ago. Looking forward to your questions.
We've got microphones up here if anybody has a question. Please use the microphones.
Guess I'm first. I noticed a little gap in your tenure from where you started Bitcoin and when you started writing. What caused you to want to contribute to Bitcoin outlets?
I've been writing pretty consistently on Bitcoin since the end of 2012, but there are just big lags in academic publication processes. So I've been writing pretty consistently since then. I will say that at the outset, I was a pretty big Bitcoin skeptic. I mentioned that I first heard about Bitcoin in 2010. I actually heard about Bitcoin because one of my colleagues in graduate school presented a paper on Bitcoin, and I remember exactly what I said to him. I said, Chuck, this is all very interesting, but you should just wrap this up and start writing on some other stuff, because I don't think this thing is going to take off, and you're going to have wasted a lot of your time. And in hindsight, I think I should have bought some Bitcoin at $3.40. And so I was pretty skeptical. But the reason I was pretty skeptical is because I understand that monies are subject to network effects, that it really matters how many other people are using an item as a medium of exchange. And at the outset, the network size of Bitcoin is pretty close to zero. And so that's an uphill battle. It turned out that there were some entrepreneurs in this space that were willing to engage in that uphill battle, and engage in it they have, and they've come up with some very creative solutions to increase the network size. So that caught me off guard, and I've revised my expectations accordingly.
How you doing? You mentioned that it was a pseudonymous account. So I had a question. Does the account name change with every transaction to keep it somewhat anonymous?
It should if you're conducting transactions appropriately, as I should say. So when you send a balance of Bitcoin to me, I can create a new account to receive that. And then I can hold all of my accounts in a single wallet. So it's not too confusing for me. But the reason you would do that is because if I create a unique account every time I receive a balance of Bitcoin, and I don't publish anywhere that I own all of these accounts, it makes it very difficult, or at least more difficult, for you or anyone else to go to the blockchain and figure out exactly what my balance looks like or who I'm conducting transactions with. And so for promoting financial privacy, it's usually suggested to create a new account every time you receive a balance of Bitcoin. And a lot of wallet services will do this for you.
I know that Bitcoin's the market leader and the big gorilla out there, but what do we have, 100, 200 other digital currencies?
More than that. Here's the top 10 as of
Ether,
today.
Litecoin, all of that. I was wondering what you think about them and how they fit into all.
So here are the top 10 altcoins, including Bitcoin. So Bitcoin and then the top 9 altcoins by market capitalization. So Ethereum is number 2. Ethereum is kind of a later addition relative to Bitcoin and Litecoin and some of those other alternatives. And the real value added of Ethereum is that it makes it easy to conduct, smart contracts. And so maybe you want to set up a transaction where I say, if a barrel of oil, Texas crude hits, say, $90 by Thursday, transfer this balance of Ethereum to you. Otherwise, don't transfer. And so it's a self-executing contract. It makes reference to some external data point and then executes the transaction accordingly. So that's a little different than Bitcoin. Ripple here is number 3. It's actually issued by a private company, Ripple Labs, and it's primarily used to make transactions between financial institutions. Litecoin, you mentioned Litecoin, so it processes transactions every 2.5 minutes instead of every 10 minutes. That's a pro and a con. It means on the one hand, transactions get processed more quickly. On the other hand, it means that your blockchain is going to be bigger, and so it's going to cost more to store that in the long run. So there's some trade-offs here, right? Tether, see the price of Bitcoin, $1.01 for Tether, and that's because Tether's claim is that they're going to stabilize the value of Tether relative to the dollar. And so they're going to adjust that supply so that it has purchasing power stability in terms of the dollar. So all of these altcoins, they try to offer something different than Bitcoin does so that they can capture some market share. But you can see here, if you just look at this first column, the market cap of Bitcoin around $70 billion. Number 2, Ethereum, just $15 billion. So it drops off pretty quickly. And if you get down here to number 10, right, Bitcoin, Binance Coin, right, we're looking at $1.3 billion. So drops off pretty quickly in terms of market cap. Bitcoin has the lion's share of this cryptocurrency market. And the reason is because cryptocurrencies, like any currency, is subject to network effects. If you're thinking about using a cryptocurrency, there's probably, and you've heard of one cryptocurrency, it's probably Bitcoin. And so that's true of you and true of most other people. So that's likely going to be the network you're going to join. So that's a big hurdle to overcome for these altcoins. The way they're trying to overcome that is by offering some difference from Bitcoin, processing transactions in a slightly different way, providing some purchasing power stability, or offering more functionality.
So in general, the value of many of these cryptos here are as tokens to sort of bring the blockchain into these global transactions. Is that their base value?
Well, their fundamental value is insofar as they're useful in transferring wealth from one person to another, right? And so most of them are using some kind of a blockchain technology in order to do that, but there are subtle differences across all of them. And so we're still trying to figure out which of these is going to be the king of the crop here. But as of now, Bitcoin is the front runner by a long shot.
Hello. Is Bitcoin similar to stock?
Well, it's an asset, right? It's an asset. But with a stock is an equity. And so if you own a stock, then you own a share of the company that stock is based on. And so that means if that company ceases to exist, all of its assets get divided up, right? And so you pay off any loans that you have, any bonds that you've issued, and then whatever's left over gets divided up among the shareholders of that stock. And so we typically think about a stock's price as being the present discounted value of the future cash flows of that business, because it's an ownership claim. You're the residual claimant on that company. With Bitcoin, it's a financial asset, it's an asset, but there's no underlying value, right? There's no if Bitcoin ceases to exist, we don't divide anything up, pay off our debtors, and give the residual claimants anything, because it's an unbacked asset. In that sense, it's much more like a dollar or a euro than a stock.
How do you think companies like JP Morgan getting into cryptocurrencies will change the way that they're valued?
That's a good question. So we have some empirical evidence of this, right? There was a company that changed its name to Blockchain something or other, and it went from being a penny stock to something greater than a penny stock, right? So saw a big surge in its price. So there's certainly some thought that if you're using this new technology, that you're at the cutting edge of your field or something like that. It's interesting that, JPM coin is what he's referring to. I believe it was just in the last week JP Morgan announced that it was going to use this blockchain technology. If we think about what the blockchain technology is really good at, right? It's about making transactions without a trusted third party, But as far as I understand, this JPM coin, it's only going to be used to make transactions between JP Morgan's customers, and they're already trusting JP Morgan. So it's not really clear to me why a distributed ledger technology is superior to a trusted ledger technology in that context, right? So we don't want to commit the all or nothing fallacy. So the example I like to give is if we just think about the usefulness of money. We can all agree that monies are useful. If you come into my money and banking class on day one, I'll tell you that barter is very cumbersome because you have to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. And if we just use a medium of exchange that's commonly accepted, we overcome that barter problem. We can all see pretty quickly that money allows us to make more transactions than we would if we had to rely on barter for everything. But that doesn't mean that we always use money. In fact, there's still a fair amount of bartering that goes on. Right? Good for good swaps. Right? Most of our personal relationships are barter relationships. Right? If you're married, right, maybe your partner will do the dishes and you'll take out the trash. You're engaging in some transactions with one another. But you're not making each other cash payments. You're engaged in a complicated barter transaction. Right? And you can do that in that situation because you have access to some institutions that you and I don't have when we're transacting. Trust and reciprocity can thrive in that environment because you're acting in an intimate order. You know each other very well. It's a repeated transaction. Right? You have ways of shunning and shaming each other that is very costly, and you don't want to incur those costs, so you treat each other well. Right? And so in that environment, we don't rely on money. We rely on barter because the other institutions we have access to, they work really well in that environment. But when we go to our grocery store, we don't say, just trust me. I'll be back next week. Right? Shunning and shaming doesn't work very well in that context. We're not in the intimate order anymore. We're in an extended order. And so with money, we can see that there are some transactions where it's essential, where it's very useful. And there are other transactions where we have alternative institutions that just work better for those purposes. And so it's the same thing here with the blockchain. Lots of companies say, oh, we're going to introduce a blockchain technology. But the question we should always ask is, why is that useful in this context? Do you have some need for making transactions without a trusted third party? Is there, say, a really high risk of counterparty risk there? If so, maybe we don't want to rely on a trusted third party. We're worried about fraud or something. But with this JPM coin, it's only being used between its customers. The ledger is, as far as I can tell, going to be run by JP Morgan and its customers, right? And so it's not like an open distributed ledger technology. And so it seems to me that it's not really clear what the value added is there, but maybe I'm missing something.
All right, so I know you want me to be quick with this, and I'll try my best, but I want to connect two dots here. Okay, so one of the concerns I have, we might be moving to a global market in the near future. If Hillary Clinton were in office, we'd probably be segueing toward that. And with that being said, then you have, let's say the Bilderberg Group, and you have all these powerful people that handle these things. Well, the connection that I have there, I would use fantasy football as an analogy, okay? So you got FanDuel, you got companies like that where it masquerades as, okay, we're going to play fantasy football, join in, it's fun, it's free, whatever. Anybody worth their salt knows that that's not just fantasy football. It's qualitative data that's being used in the guise of fantasy football. So what they're doing is they're getting all this data, they're using sophisticated algorithms, and they're using multiple lineups many times, and that's how they win, basically. So my concern is down the road, you get the powers that be, those that know these things. You delve into this market, you start putting everything in, and as they're segueing into a housing market, for example, which is, I've heard that happening. So I'm just curious as to how can you kind of watch your six, as they would say in the military, or how would you just kind of keep yourself abreast of all these things? I'm not quite a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but at the same time, I'm not probably far off either, because it does concern me, and so I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I'm a monetary economist, so I hear a lot of conspiracy theories. And so first, let me just say that the world is a complicated place. And anytime you come across some view where there's some very simple explanation for how a small group of people are making some decisions that affect all of us immensely and we just can't see it, right? Well, that's probably unlikely. It's very complicated, this world we live in. There are a lot of moving parts, and the idea that there's some kind of a cabal controlling the world is probably a fantasy. But to the extent that you are worried about people making use of your data, and that seems like a pretty valid concern, what can you do there? Well, option one is to not hand your data over so readily. Option two is to make use of technologies that allow you to act in a way that's pseudonymous. So if you're acting on the internet, you might want to use something like Tor so that people don't see where your internet traffic is coming from or going to. And if you're making payments, maybe you don't want to use a traditional bank account where someone is collecting all of your payment, or potentially collecting all your payment transaction data. Instead, you want to use some transaction mechanism where you're quasi-anonymous. So if that is a concern for you, you're interested in financial privacy, you might want to use cash, or you might want to use some kind of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Dash or Monero that is very privacy focused. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theory type, and so I don't think that that's a huge concern. I'm not too worried about people mining my data in ways that I find nefarious, right? I also don't send you all my bank account statements, right? And so there's some reasonable amount of financial privacy and any kind of privacy between open access, everyone knows everything about you, and let's all go be hermits in the woods somewhere, right? But as for some transactions, we're thinking about money, for some transactions, it's probably just fine that other people know what your transactions are. And for other transactions, you probably want to keep those private. And so again, there are probably multiple payment technologies that we want to rely on.
Last question.
Hi. Thank you for being here. My question is about the blockchain technology and this idea of a public ledger, and I was wondering if you saw potential for that in other industries besides just using it as a currency.
Absolutely. Anytime you have a ledger, you have a potential application of the blockchain technology. So just a couple examples, for example. At the moment, most of our car titling systems are handled by governments. And so if I want to sell you my car, you and I, we schlep down to a notary, right? They certify that I've sold this car to you, and then you take that title to the courthouse and get this processed so that the title is transferred from me to you. But what's going on here? Well, we have a ledger of car titles, right? And when I transfer that to you, this ledger has to be, it has to be debited. The title has to be taken away from me, and it has to be credited. It has to be given to you. And so we have a potential application for a blockchain technology. Anytime we see a ledger, right, we're going to update that ledger somehow. We could update it using a blockchain technology. The question is whether we should update it using a blockchain technology. That is there some reason that for this particular purpose, it's cheaper or safer or something? There's some reason why this new way of updating the ledger is superior to alternative ways of updating a ledger.
All right. Thank you, Will, for a wonderful talk.
It's my pleasure.
Mr. Coachman.